Welcome to our exploration of the economic machine. Chapter 1. The illusion of linear time and the mechanics of the economic machine. Most human beings navigate their entire existence, believing that the reality they woke up to this morning will remain the exact same reality they will wake up to tomorrow. We are biologically programmed to extrapolate the recent past into the indefinite future. This cognitive blind spot represents the ultimate illusion of linear time. The cold, unforgiving truth of human history dictates that time does not move in a straight line. History operates as a relentless mechanical engine driven by logical cause and effect relationships that repeat over and over again, in predictable yet terrifying macroeconomic cycles. When the gears of this grand machine shift, the ground beneath our feet cracks open, swallowing the ignorant and rewarding only those who intimately understand the underlying mechanics of the system. To truly comprehend why empires rise and world orders inevitably collapse, we must strip away the complexities of modern geopolitics and examine the microscopic source code of human behavior. In 1944, mathematician John von Neumann and economist Oscar Morgenstern published a masterpiece that fundamentally altered our understanding of societal architecture. These two scholars sought to answer one profound question concerning human interaction. When the decisions of individuals mutually influence one another, what exactly happens? The reality of global economics is never a transparent game of chess where every move is visible on a flat board. It is a ruthless game of poker. You hold cards hidden from the world while your opponents conceal their hands from you. Survival often requires you to intentionally mislead your opponents about your true intentions. This simple logic forms the invisible foundation of every financial market, every corporate war, and every sovereign conflict today. At the very heart of this dynamic lies the most haunting narrative in all of social science, namely the prisoner's dilemma. Imagine two business partners arrested and placed in separate interrogation rooms. The interrogators offer a cruel mathematical choice. If both suspects remain silent, each serves 1 year in prison. If you confess while your partner remains silent, you go free directly and your partner serves 5 years. If your partner confesses while you remain silent, the roles reverse, giving you the 5-year sentence. If both individuals confess, both must serve 3 years. Place yourself inside that cold interrogation room. You must anticipate your partner's choice before making your own. If they remain silent, confessing sets you free. If they confess, confessing saves you from a disastrous 5-year sentence. Regardless of what the other person chooses, confessing always yields the mathematically superior individual outcome. This concept is known in game theory as the dominant strategy. The inevitable result unfolding inside those rooms is that two perfectly rational individuals will both choose to confess, each receiving 3 years behind bars, even though mutual silence would have resulted in only 1 year each. This is the utter tragedy of human interaction. Individual rationality irreversibly leads to collective irrationality. This microscopic paradox explains why two competing coffee shops opening next to each other will engage in a vicious price war until both go bankrupt. It explains why entire industrial sectors suffer massive losses because no single corporation is willing to voluntarily reduce production first. Whoever stops first bleeds the most. As a society expands during the upward phase of a macroeconomic debt cycle, abundant liquidity and expanding resources mask this inherent dilemma. The tides rise, lifting all boats. When the engine runs out of fuel, when the long-term debt cycle reaches its zenith, the global economy morphs into a gigantic planetary-scale prisoner's dilemma. This introduces the concept of the Nash equilibrium, named after the brilliant mathematician John Nash. He proved mathematically that in any finite game involving rational participants, The system will eventually settle into a stable state where no individual wants to unilaterally change their choice. In our saturated debt-heavy world today, that equilibrium represents a death trap. No sovereign nation will voluntarily devalue its currency first. No central bank will willingly induce a depression to purge toxic assets. No elite class will relinquish its wealth to alleviate social inequality. Any unilateral move to save the collective system jeopardizes the individual actor. The machine, therefore, becomes locked. The participants stare at each other across the geopolitical table, fully aware that the prevailing economic architecture is unsustainable, fully aware that the global debt burden voids the planet's capacity for productivity. The mechanics of game theory dictate that they must continue playing the hand they were dealt, accelerating together toward the cliff edge. Humanity functions exactly like a biological organism bound by strict mathematical rules. Transitions between historical eras are never negotiated peacefully. They erupt as violent systemic resets prompted by the inescapable mathematics of the prisoner's dilemma reaching its breaking point. When existing rules fail to provide mutual benefit, the entire board gets violently overturned. Every human society and financial paradigm has a mathematically predetermined lifespan dictated by the accumulation of debt and the eventual reversal of the global wealth equation. Chapter 2: The British Blueprint and the Weaponization of Global Settlement. At the absolute apex of commerce exists a cold and unforgiving truth. The creator of physical products can never defeat the creator of platforms, and the creator of platforms can never defeat the issuer of the underlying currency. To understand how global order sustains itself and eventually exploits the world, we must examine the ultimate financial predator of the 19th century, the British Empire. During the zenith of the Industrial Revolution, Britain operated as the workshop of the world. However, capital is eternally insatiable and naturally migrates toward avenues of maximum return with minimal friction. The British elite soon recognized a fatal flaw in pure manufacturing. Operating physical factories demanded enduring high fixed asset depreciation, navigating unpredictable raw material volatility, and managing labor disputes. These friction points inevitably lead to marginal diminishing returns on equity. Facing this mathematical dead end, the industrial magnates of Manchester executed a ruthless pivot. They liquidated their tangible assets, discarding the smoke-filled chimneys and the roar of steam engines, relocating their capital to the quiet, leather armchairs of the City of London. They transformed themselves from hands-on industrialists into financial overlords, seeking to master the abstract realm of bonds, credit, and exchange rates. To achieve absolute hegemony, they understood that they must monopolize the pricing power of global wealth. This required forcing the entire world to adopt a singular, uncompromising settlement baseline. Leveraging their overwhelming trade dominance and the intimidating presence of the Royal Navy, Britain reinstated the rigid rules of the gold standard, originally formulated by Isaac Newton. They issued an ironclad guarantee. Any British pound could be unconditionally exchanged for a fixed amount of gold in London. Consequently, the fragmented global trade system, which previously relied on chaotic mixtures of silver and copper, was forced to submit. Nations like the United States, Germany, and France surrendered their sovereign pricing models to reduce trade friction. Pegging their own currencies to the gold standard, Britain had successfully engineered a closed-loop monopoly, establishing a planetary-scale toll booth. When a Brazilian coffee exporter traded with a German merchant, they demanded payment in a London bank acceptance bill. Every major global transaction flowed silently through the ledgers of the City of London. British financial institutions extracted discount interest and transaction fees from every corner of the earth, accumulating staggering wealth without moving a single physical ounce of gold. They extracted the ultimate privilege known as seigniorage, utilizing sovereign credit to cast purchasing power out of thin air, appropriating foreign resources and labor with printed paper. However, the most devastating mechanism in their arsenal was the execution of tidal harvesting. This was a masterclass in systemic plunder. When domestic capital saturated London, the Bank of England actively engineered a flood by lowering the benchmark discount rate. A torrent of cheap British capital was unleashed upon emerging markets, such as Argentina or the United States. These developing nations swallowed massive leverage to finance railway, infrastructure, and agricultural expansion, cultivating dangerous illusions of an economic miracle as their asset prices skyrocketed. This capital injection operated as a deceptive trap through tide sellers' credit. A £10 million infrastructure loan granted to Argentina never actually left the City of London. The funds were simply transferred on paper to a British steel corporation mandated to supply the railway tracks. The emerging nation mortgaged its future to acquire British industrial overcapacity, pledging generations of agricultural exports to service the debts. Once the prey grew sufficiently fattened, the financial overlords initiated the ebb phase. As global bubbles stretched to the breaking point, the Bank of England violently and suddenly raised interest rates. The faucet of global liquidity slammed shut instantly. Desperate capital fled the emerging markets, rushing back to the perceived safety of London. Developing currencies evaporated, sovereign defaults rippled across continents, and tangible asset valuations suffered catastrophic collapses. Amidst this orchestrated chaos, the British financial elite re-entered the devastated markets not as saviors but as liquidators. They weaponized their hoarded cash to legally confiscate the crown jewels of defaulting nations, deep water ports, strategic railways, and inexhaustible mines, acquiring them at brutal fractions of their true value. Through the patient manipulation of macroeconomic cycles, the British machine methodically stripped the physical wealth of the earth without firing a single military projectile. Hegemony is not maintained through industrial output alone, but through the absolute authority to dictate the rules of settlement and manipulate the price of global credit. Chapter 3: The Furnace of American Capitalism and the Expansion of the Frontier. While the British Empire perfected the art of financial extraction across the oceans, a vast, untamed continent was incubating the next iteration of the global engine. 400 years ago, North America was viewed by European monarchs as a barbaric wilderness, a peripheral dumping ground for exiles and dissidents. Yet it was precisely this isolation that allowed a radically different economic and political architecture to take root. In 1620, a fragile vessel named the Mayflower deposited over 100 Puritans onto a desolate shore. Before disembarking, they signed a brief document pledging to form a self-governing civil body. This Mayflower Compact acted as the foundational source code for a society devoid of hereditary aristocracy. Driven by a ferocious sense of divine destiny, these settlers laid the groundwork for a machine optimized entirely for pragmatic expansion and unrestricted capital accumulation. As the colonies expanded into a sovereign nation after 1776, the American engine developed a fatal internal contradiction. It operated two mutually incompatible economic operating systems simultaneously. The northern states embraced the relentless logic of industrializations, characterized by free labor, mechanized factories, and dense urban financial hubs. Conversely, the southern states clung to a stagnant agrarian model wholly dependent on millions of enslaved human beings to fuel the lucrative cotton export market. By 1860, the South produced two-thirds of the world's cotton supply, a commodity regarded as the white gold of the era. However, a true capitalist superpower cannot tolerate a fractured supply chain or a divided labor market. The system required absolute unification. The American Civil War, ignited in 1861, was not merely a moral crusade. It was a brutal macroeconomic restructuring. The conflict devoured over 620,000 lives, the bloodiest purge in the nation's history. Yet, in the cold calculus of the economic machine, this devastating bloodletting was mathematically necessary. By obliterating the southern plantation economy, the war eradicated the final institutional obstacles inhibiting the total domination of industrial capitalism. The subsequent Homestead Act of 1862 distributed millions of acres of Western land, virtually free of charge, rapidly expanding the agrarian consumer base and funneling European labor directly into the veins of the maturing American infrastructure. What followed was an era of unprecedented mechanical acceleration known as the Gilded Age. Between 1865 and 1900, the United States transformed into a terrifying productive behemoth. Railway mileage exploded from 35,000 miles to over 200,000 miles, surpassing the entirety of Europe combined. Steel production skyrocketed from a trivial 20,000 tons to nearly 9 million tons. Driven by the doctrine of manifest destiny, the nation relentlessly absorbed territory like a voracious serpent, swallowing the Louisiana Purchase, annexing Texas, and seizing the Pacific coast from Mexico. This geographic gluttony was underpinned by the systematic and ruthless displacement of the indigenous populations, an unapologetic application of social Darwinism where the weak were consumed to fuel the growth of the strong. However, exponential growth always generates extreme internal friction. As titans like Rockefeller and Carnegie erected unprecedented monopolies over oil and steel, the chasm between the apex capitalists and the base labor force expanded to perilous extremes. While the elites amassed wealth unimaginable in previous centuries, the proletariat endured brutal 12-hour shifts, triggering violent clashes like the Haymarket Riot of 1886. Yet despite the severe societal ruptures, the core architecture of the United States remained intact. By the dawn of the 20th century, this unrelenting engine had surpassed Great Britain to become the most powerful industrial force on the planet, positioning itself for the inevitable global takeover. The ascent of a superpower requires the ruthless alignment of political will and geographic expansion to maximize industrial output. Chapter 4. The Passing of the Torch and the Establishment of the 80-Year Order. The ultimate mechanism for global wealth transfer is not diplomacy, it is total war. The two world wars of the 20th century functioned as massive, bloody margin calls for the overleveraged European empires. While the old powers systematically bombed their physical infrastructure into ashes, the United States sat safely across the Atlantic, executing the most profitable geopolitical arbitrage in human history. By 1945, the industrial production capacity of the United States had exploded to 250% of its 1929 levels. While Europe and Asia lay in utter ruins, America emerged as the unrivaled arsenal of democracy. It was no longer just a manufacturing powerhouse. It had transformed into the ultimate global creditor, holding the mortgage on Western civilization. Hegemony demands a formalized ledger. In 1944, as the war approached its conclusion, the architects of the new economic machine convened to formally execute the passing of the torch. The British pound, exhausted and drowning in sovereign war debt, was systematically dethroned. The United States dollar assumed the mantle of the world's sole reserve currency. The rules of global trade were irreversibly rewritten under the Bretton Woods system. The dollar was exclusively tethered to gold, and all other sovereign currencies were tethered to the dollar. The United States had successfully replicated and massively scaled the British financial platform, gaining the absolute authority to dictate global settlement. By the end of the conflict, the United States commanded a staggering 50% of the entire global gross domestic product. To maintain the relentless momentum of this massive productive engine, the United States could not allow its newly acquired debtors to completely collapse. The system required functioning consumers. Thus, the Marshall Plan was initiated, funneling $13 billion into the reconstruction of Western Europe. While promoted as a humanitarian triumph in the cold calculus of the macroeconomic machine, it was a brilliantly executed vendor financing scheme. The United States extended credit to devastated nations so they could purchase American industrial exports, effectively locking the European continent into the dollar ecosystem and permanently securing captive markets for American overcapacity. Simultaneously, the American empire expanded its defensive perimeter through financial leverage exemplified by the Truman Doctrine. In 1947, which directed $400 million to Greece and Turkey to contain rival ideologies. Yet, the mechanical laws of the debt cycle are inescapable and unforgiving. Just as the industrial magnates of Manchester eventually abandoned their smoky factories for the financial wizardry of London, the American empire began its slow terminal pivot. Over the subsequent decades, the United States gradually transitioned from exporting physical manufactured goods to exporting its currency and absorbing the world's savings. The complete abandonment of the gold standard in 1971 severed the final tether to physical reality, unlocking the faucet of infinite credit expansion. The nation methodically transformed from the world's workshop into the world's largest leveraged hedge fund, repeating the exact structural evolution of its British predecessor. By prioritizing the printing of chips over the production of goods, the seeds of systemic vulnerability were definitively sown. An empire reaches its zenith when it transitions from exporting physical goods to exporting its currency, inevitably sowing the seeds of its own systemic vulnerability. Chapter 5: The Terminal Velocity of the Debt Supercycle. The engine of the 80-year order was built upon a foundation of endless credit expansion. Following the unprecedented post-war boom, the system encountered its first severe structural resistance in the 1970s, when the United States severed the final tether between the dollar and physical gold. In 1971, the faucet of unrestricted fiat currency was violently opened. The twin oil crisis of 1973 and 1979 exposed the fragility of a consumption-driven economy, igniting a vicious cycle of stagflation. Economic stagnation collided with punishing inflation, stripping the purchasing power of the working class and signaling that the industrial engine was sputtering. To rescue the stalling machine, the architects of the financial system administered a lethal dose of monetary adrenaline. The era of financial deregulation commenced in the 1980s. The illusion of perpetual prosperity was no longer sustained by forging steel or manufacturing automobiles, but by engineering extreme financial leverage. Wall Street constructed elaborate architectures of synthetic wealth, designing derivatives and collateralized debt obligations that multiplied abstract capital while completely detaching it from tangible physical reality. The empire was gorging itself on borrowed time. This unchecked leverage inevitably triggered the subprime mortgage collapse in 2008. The global financial tsunami vaporized venerable institutions like Lehman Brothers and shredded the portfolios of millions. Yet, observe closely how the system responded. Instead of allowing the natural, albeit painful, liquidation of toxic debt required to reset the economic machine, central banks worldwide flooded the faltering engine with trillions of dollars through quantitative easing. They did not eradicate the structural disease. They merely transferred the malignant cancer from private corporate balance sheets directly onto the sovereign ledger of the state. Today, we are witnessing the absolute terminal velocity of that fatal decision. By the end of last year, the total volume of global debt had skyrocketed to an incomprehensible $348 trillion. It surged by nearly $29 trillion in a single year, marking the most violent acceleration since the global health crisis. At the very core of the empire, the federal debt of the United States has shattered the $38 trillion threshold, leaping an entire $1 trillion in merely 2 months. The mathematical limit of the debt supercycle has been breached. The machine is now cannibalizing itself to stay alive. Last year, the cost to simply service the interest on the American national debt surpassed $1.2 trillion, eclipsing the total military expenditure of the superpower for the very first time in history. When a sovereign government collects $5 trillion in revenue but unflinchingly spends $7 trillion, forcing the immediate borrowing of another $2 trillion every single year just to keep the lights on, the illusion of solvency evaporates. A system enters its terminal phase when the cost of servicing past liabilities permanently exceeds the output of present and future productivity. Chapter 6. The Echoes of 1936 and the 5 Forces of Disintegration. We have arrived at the mathematical limit of the 80-year order. The year 2026 bears a chilling and unmistakable resemblance to the year 1936. This is not a casual observation. It is the calculated conclusion of Ray Dalio, the mastermind behind the largest hedge fund in the world. In a monumental 10,000-word essay published on February 14th, which was consumed by over 50 million minds, within a single day, he delivered a verdict that froze the blood of the global elite. The world order that has maintained relative stability since the Second World War is now officially dead. To understand the gravity of this proclamation, we must look back at 1936. That era represented the final narrow window of deceptive calm before the absolute destruction of the global order. It was a time when all the fuses of systemic disaster had already been lit by the crushing weight of unpayable debts and deepening social fractures, yet the vast majority of the global population remained completely oblivious to the approaching inferno. They continued their daily routines, blind to the fact that the invisible architecture of their society was collapsing. Today, we are witnessing the exact same structural decay. We are not merely facing a financial correction. We are navigating a multi-dimensional systemic restructuring. Dalio meticulously deconstructed 5 irresistible and interlocking forces that are currently tearing apart the fabric of the world. Force number 1 operates as the fracturing of the global monetary order as trust in fiat currencies erodes. Force number 2 manifests as internal political orders tearing at the seams due to widening wealth inequality and deepening polarization. Force number 3 represents the violent realignment of the geopolitical landscape as rising powers challenge the established hegemon. Force number 4 erupts through technological revolutions, specifically artificial intelligence, causing unprecedented disruptions to labor markets and social cohesion. Force number 5 emerges as the escalation of extreme climate events, putting massive strain on global supply chains and resource allocation. The convergence of these 5 pressures makes our present era uniquely volatile, adding new layers of complexity over the 1936 paradigm. We are already engaged in a world war, albeit through unconventional means. The silent shift towards multidimensional warfare is already upon us. We are living through searing trade wars, ruthless technology wars, brutal capital wars, and intense geopolitical conflicts. The tariff barriers, the microchip export bans, the freezing of sovereign assets, and the weaponization of energy supplies are not isolated incidents. They are the deafening overture to a much darker symphony. When a sovereign entity cannot service its debts through production, history dictates only three possible mathematical resolutions: massive money printing to devalue the currency, draconian tax increases that crush economic growth, or the complete restructuring brought about by global conflict. Regardless of which path the machine takes, the ultimate price is always extracted from the purchasing power, the savings, and the wages of the ordinary citizen. The artillery has not yet fired, but the siege has already begun. The rebuilding of a global paradigm is never a peaceful transition. It is a chaotic friction driven by the simultaneous overheating of economics, politics, and natural ecology. Chapter Silent Exodus of the Apex Predators. When you seek to understand the true biological health of a jungle, you do not listen to the cheerful chattering of the birds in the canopy. You closely observe the silent, deliberate movements of the apex predators on the forest floor. The greatest tragedy of any monumental paradigm shift is the cognitive dissonance of the masses. The cruel reality is that the vast majority of ordinary people remain utterly oblivious to the tectonic plates violently shifting beneath them. They continue to operate using the defunct logic of a peacetime economy. They diligently deposit their fading currency into fixed savings accounts. They grit their teeth to pay inflated mortgages, and they blindly chase the latest speculative market trends, clinging to the naive belief that mere hard work and passive compliance will secure their future. They do not pause to ask why the smartest, wealthiest, and most systemically connected individuals on the planet are synchronously executing the exact opposite strategy. The ultimate proof that the 80-year order is collapsing does not come from academic papers or political speeches. It emanates directly from the cold, hard actions of the individuals. Standing at the absolute zenith of the financial pyramid, they are voting with their capital, and they are sprinting towards the exits. Observe the calculated ruthlessness of Warren Buffett. Even as equity markets continue to test all-time highs, generating euphoria among retail investors, the 95-year-old oracle executed a massive, methodical sell-off of his holdings. He continuously reduced his positions in core foundational assets like Apple and Bank of America over dozens of consecutive quarters. He is currently hoarding a staggering $380 billion in pure cash. To put that astronomical number into perspective, it is more than 3 times the entire foreign exchange reserves held by the Central Bank of South Korea. Buffett has navigated countless market cycles over his century on Earth. Whenever he accumulates capital of this magnitude, a bloodbath in the markets inevitably follows, just as it did in 1999 before the dot-com crash and in 2007 before the global financial tsunami. He is not losing his edge. He is patiently waiting for the ultimate liquidation event, positioning himself to be the harvester when the tide finally recedes. Simultaneously, we witnessed the strategic retreat of another generational titan. On February 26th, companies under the umbrella of 97-year-old Ka-shing issued a joint announcement revealing the complete liquidation of their entire stake in the United Kingdom power grid. This was not a peripheral asset or a speculative venture. This was a core distribution network, supplying power to over 8.5 million users across London and the southeast of England. He had nurtured this indispensable asset for 16 years after purchasing it, during the aftermath of the last crisis, only to decisively cash out over 110 billion Hong Kong dollars in a single stroke. Coupled with the forced reclamation of his port assets in Panama, we are watching a master of global commerce transition from unrestricted global expansion to extreme risk contraction. When a man who has survived 7 decades of cutthroat commerce liquidates utility monopolies, it is a blaring siren that the fuses of the current system have burned out. Meanwhile, the smart money within the bowels of Wall Street is executing a pivot that defies the mainstream narrative. In February, Goldman Sachs coined a term for this massive capital migration: halo trades, standing for heavy asset low obsolescence. Capital is fleeing the illusion of paper wealth and the promises of the digital cloud, seeking immediate refuge in tangible, physical reality. The elite are aggressively purchasing coal mines, power grids, chemical plants, and oil pipelines. Since early last year, this heavy asset portfolio has outperformed light assets by over 35 percentage points. The message broadcasted by these actions is brutally clear. When the abstract financial system falters and the digital ledger erases trillions in synthetic wealth, only those who control the foundational physical mechanics of civilization will survive. The elite understand the imminent sovereign margin call. They are aggressively deleveraging, hoarding unprecedented liquidity, and securing essential physical resources. The wealth transfer mechanism operates silently. It does not announce its arrival. It quietly evaporates the purchasing power of the unprepared masses and transfers it directly into the vaults of those who own unleveraged, scarcity-driven assets. In the final stages of a systemic collapse, the ultimate strategy shifts from maximizing abstract returns to securing indestructible physical assets and pure liquidity, transforming the prepared observer into the ultimate beneficiary of the cycle. Chapter 8: The Architecture of Personal Survival. In a collapsing paradigm, since the old rules are crumbling and the new paradigm has not yet fully crystallized, we exist in a highly dangerous liminal window. How does the ordinary individual navigate this historic meat grinder? The first rule of survival in a disintegrating order is to immediately and ruthlessly audit your liabilities. In times of stability and expansion, debt acts as a ladder, a lever used to accelerate the climb toward wealth. However, in an era of systemic collapse, debt instantly transforms into a guillotine. If your liabilities exceed your resilient capacity to repay, whether that manifests as a mortgage, an auto loan, or consumer credit, you must aggressively deleverage. The smart money is not hoarding liquidity because they have forgotten how to invest. They are accumulating cash because during the peak of systemic uncertainty, simply surviving at the bottom of the cycle is worth 10,000 times more than attempting to maximize returns at the top. Second, you must eradicate concentration risk. Do not place the entirety of your capital within a single vulnerable basket. Wall Street did not pivot to heavy assets without profound mathematical justification. Relying solely on residential real estate in a single geographic area, or concentrating all your life savings within one fragile banking institution constitutes a recipe for total annihilation in a volatile environment. Diversification across multiple asset classes and distinct jurisdictions remains the oldest and most indestructible wisdom for defending against the unpredictable volatility of a sovereign reset. You must uncouple your destiny from a singular point of failure. Third, and most crucially, you must invest heavily in your own macroeconomic literacy. The reason the masses are perennially harvested by the financial system is because they completely lack the ability to read the underlying signals. They follow the roar of the crowd into the peak of the bubble and succumb to panic at the absolute bottom. Titans like Ray Dalio and Warren Buffett possess access to superior information, but their true dominance stems from their profound understanding of structural cycles. By decoding the bottom-up logic of the economic machine, you can position yourself to see the approaching storm long before the first raindrop falls. In this age of information warfare and financial deception, The cognitive ability to discern immutable reality from engineered illusion stands as your most valuable asset. As the old world slowly burns away and the architects of the new system begin to lay their foundations within the ashes, we must coldly accept that the next 20 years will not resemble the past 80. We are navigating a pivot point in human history, a moment where the ledger of global wealth is being violently rebalanced by the relentless logic of the machine. The water always seeks its lowest point, and capital will inevitably flow towards true safety when the illusion of peace shines thinnest. Preparing for this new order is not an act of paranoia. It is an act of supreme rationality. If you wish to continue exploring these hidden truths and arm yourself with deep cognitive frameworks in an increasingly chaotic age, subscribe to this channel and engage with our content. Leave the noise behind and focus exclusively on the immutable laws that govern our reality. As the ultimate sovereign margin call across the earth, I leave you with one final question to anchor your mind. When the global tide permanently recedes and the illusion of artificial credit is brutally stripped away, will you be found holding the worthless paper receipts of a dead paradigm, or will you possess the indestructible knowledge and assets required to command the next century? Survival during a global restructuring demands the elimination of vulnerability, the rejection of outdated peacetime logic, and the mental fortitude to navigate the tectonic shifts of history.